fourth episode of True Norwegian black metal from the 90s, the crash course of it. So with this series, if you have been seeing the previous episodes, you pretty much know what's the game. To give you a little bit of idea which albums to check out, what's the story, roughly give or take, which albums are the good ones if we're going for some Norwegian black metal from the 90s. When I say 90s, I mean these are all the bands that started already in the 90s. For the sake of this series, I have just limited the bands in the show for the ones that were active already in the 90s. Mind you, there are some really good bands that have been founded on later on, but they go beyond the scope of this series. Why so? Well, even with the 90s, there are roughly some 70 bands to go through. And as the case has been from the start, going first with the essentials, then with another set of big bands, and then slowly we go down towards the smaller bands. So if you're looking for some essential bands, the kind of pioneers of Norwegian black metal from the 90s, go for the first episodes. Now with the fourth one, we have still relatively big bands, but not the biggest ones. So the bands today are Gorgoroth, Carpathian Forest and Taake. And in that order, for the sake of numbers. Now it's hard to really sometimes figure out which one had more impact, which is more dominant than the other. So there are various factors why I decided to go in this order with the bands. That is by different episodes, but also for this particular one. Now roughly these all bands are something like the same size category. Not the bigger ones, definitely not the smallest ones. So bigger than the so-called medium size. And after all, these are bands that have been here quite some time. Taake is a little bit younger than the two other bands in this show, but neither of them were active in the late 80s or even super early 90s. I'm talking about 1990. But only 2 years later, things started to change. So when bands like Mayhem, Dogthrone, Burzum, Immortal started paving the way with, 1990, 1991, well, soon after there were more bands. And I previously gone through those bands as well as bands like Enslaved or Emperor and Ulver. So now it's time for this trio which were there to make some waves. Last FM listens, these are follower numbers, so it's not like I just handpick them randomly. See in the West and often recalled culture capital, if you will. There are lots of bands coming from that place, and also a lot of important events happen in Bergen area. So Gorgoroth is one of those names. If we take a look, however, at Carpathian Forest, they are from a different part, Sandnes, and Taake also for Bergen. Now there's also another thing which kind of links these bands together. For example, Taake main man, the only main member of the band, Höst, has been taking part of Gorgoroth live. Also, he has spent some times with Carpathian Forest and Ragnarok, another band that we will tackle in later episodes, etc. The list is interesting. He's very, very connected, great person also, and all that stuff. And now people might be pointing out, yeah, there was Thule before Taake, and Taake is 1995. Not exactly late to the party, I mean, Oliver, roughly, Dimmu Borgir at the same time, 1995. But some people might say, yeah, there's a big difference between 1991 and 1995. That is very true when you're like in your 80s. I mean, 80s, 18. I mean, 18 versus 22. It's a big gap. When you're like 30 to 34, not that mattering anymore. Not to mention in your 40s, 40, 44. The same shit, really. But back in the days when you were like 17 versus 21, 16 versus 20, that might have meant the difference between going to bars and whatnot. So people who were like born in, say, 1974 versus people 1978, that would have been a big thing. Me, I'm born in 1975, in case you're asking and wondering, like, what is my relevance to this age? So, had I been in Norway, had I had my same kind of a similar background in Norway, I would probably be in the very same kind of bands with these guys. But me, personally, my first black metal came out in 1996. I am a little bit late to the party, even though I've been listening to black metal around 1993, 1994 would be, I guess, more accurate. So I could say, yeah, I know what it is to be a little bit late to the party. I wasn't there in 1990. But now, 30 years later, give or take, things are quite different. So it's time to take a look at all these bands. Like I said, enough rambling for the introduction. Let's go through Gorgoroth discography and point out the more important ones, especially according to me anyway. This is my video after all. You don't have to agree what I am saying here. Now, since Gorgoroth has started in 1992, a lot of things started happening right away. A couple of demos, which some people, of course, refer as the, the focus point, the anchor point or whatever. But as always, it's the albums that matter the most because that's what you define. And Pentagram came 1994. Probably the best album by them, but I'm still on the verge between these two, Antichrist and Pentagram. And why Gorgoroth is so important in terms of Norwegian black metal is that they did things quite different. I mean, where Immortal went pretty much straight away after the first album, very kind of a fast black metal with grim style and all, and bands like Emperor and, well, even Enslaved in terms, when more adding keyboards and kind of a symphonic direction. Well, Emperor was more there, and Enslaved a little bit progressive with the Viking metal stuff. Gorgoroth was doing kind of a mid-tempo, rocking black metal, but still very, very grim and quite raw. Not maybe as raw as bands like Darkthrone did already with, starting from A Blaze in the Northern Sky and all that stuff, but definitely leaning thatwards. And all these bands having different style. I mean, you really can mix Burzum with Darkthrone, with Satyricon, with Dimmu Borgir, with Emperor, and you get the list. And this is one of the main factors. I mean, we all know the hype with, church arsons and, killings and all that stuff. But when it comes to musical directions, all these bands, they were not copycats of one another. When we go for the old school Norwegian black metal, true Norwegian black metal as people like to say, they all have their distinctive styles, and Gorgoroth was one of them, which I think is one of the kind of a founding stones, the kind of a main ingredients of the whole thing, which was already happening early 1990s. So when albums like Pentagram and Antichrist came out, I mean, it was pretty solid. Like, this is a band that defines itself with its very, very own style. At the same time, it's not, super fast, but it's not slow either. It's definitely not symphonic. It's not overly melodic. And it doesn't have, the kind of a fancier things or more, how to say, I'm looking for a word here. Let me put it this way. It's definitely grim. It's not adding clean vocals, female singing, synthesizer parts, and all that stuff. It's not sophisticated, the word I was looking for. Thank you. And that's already like, okay, they put that on the map. And with Darkthrone and similar bands, there's a little bit Carpathian Forest coming up, as you were wondering. And that, I think, really, defined. This is Gorgoroth. Now, however, before we go through the discography a little bit, and the rundown, the thing here is, Infernus is the only original member of the band. So if you look at the nowadays list, and by the way, Metal Archives doesn't really agree with that, you get to see all these guys. They're different guys. They're newer ones. Same goes for the live members. I mean, you really have people from 2000s and even from various countries. It's not like everybody is really from the Norwegian scene. But this list is quite big when you really go through the live lineup and all that stuff. Now, if you take a look at the past members, you will find interesting people like Samoth of Ember fame, Frost from Satyricon, etc. And different people of various bands. I mean, this is quite interesting. Also, a couple of people who have died, unfortunately, like Bodel already, and Grim, who used to play also in Immortal. So a lot of linking has happened, and this is very, very important thing for people to understand when we're talking about Norwegian black metal. I mean, a lot of Norwegian black metal from the same era as me or these guys would probably know it more accurately. But I guess I'm accurate enough when I go through a little bit of these facts so that you get to dig deeper and all that stuff. And of course, there's an interesting thing because a lot of vocalists changed. A lot of people will remember Hat. I'm saying it jokingly. Hat. It obviously means hot, like hate. Here it is explained. And he was the founding vocalist, and he defined Pentagram and Antichrist. Some people probably think he's the best vocalist of Gorgoroth ever because he was there to shape it up. But Pest took it pretty quickly, and I think he did a good job. He still does good job. Also, Hest from Gorgoroth does good job, especially with, being a live member and all. And then there was obviously Gal, which I guess is the most famous Gorgoroth vocalist, because he joined the band when the band was already being really hyped, being signed to Nuclear Blast and all that stuff. So there was a lot of things going on. But there is a couple of things which is worth mentioning. First of all, after these two first albums, which are, in my opinion, the best Gorgoroth albums, a really great third one, Under the Sign of Hell, came quickly, 1997. And now you might remember, if you've been viewing the previous episodes, viewing, and you really know what I've been saying for so many bands. A lot of bands started going in decline between 1997 and 1999. Roughly 1998 is the point, if you had to name one year when a lot of those bands started to go sour. That applies to bands like Ember, which just lost the edge after Anthems. That applies to bands like Immortal, which went totally different direction after their grim start. Applies to Darkthrone, which started doing something else after their Unholy Trinity, even though I like a lot of their later albums. Applied to Burzum being in prison, applied to Mayhem with Grand Declaration of War, etc. You already know the drill. 1998 was a turning point for so many bands. Some people later on blame it on the so-called Matrix era. Remember that Matrix came out roughly around 1999. But this musical style started to change before that. It was almost like these guys in their early 20s suddenly matured up and they're like, okay, this kind of a traditional black metal, be it with Satyricon or the names I already mentioned, let's abandon it. And when Matrix 1999 came out and became this big fashion statement, and suddenly everybody was wearing these long coats, let's go all the way, trench coats and all that stuff, let's abandon old school heavy metal outfits. And suddenly people wanted to look like, Neo and the guys from Matrix. But by that time, already these albums that started to change the whole Norwegian black metal were there. So how about Gorgoroth? Yes, Destroyer, or about how to philosophize with a hammer. I remember that album was quite a bit talked when it came out in 1998. It kind of sounded very much like the previous Gorgoroth albums, but something has changed. And in my opinion, not for the better. So I kind of understand why it has lower rating on average here than the previous ones. Then again, Insipid Satan, which came out 2 years later, in my opinion, is quite a bit better. I disagree with these scores here, however. I would say Destroyer is roughly an 8, and Insipid Satan something like 8.5. Not big difference, but still. Whereas the previous ones, the first ones, about 9ers. And even with Twilight of the Idols 2003, I think it's a really, really good album. Better than Destroyer. And only after that it started to go in decline. But I would say the first bump happened in 1998, even if you dismiss that Hot was already gone from the band. So phases were happening, lineups were changing, the musical things. And around this era, later on, there was this crisis when, Gal and King of Hell tried to get Gorgoroth under their names, even though it was Infernus band all the way along. And now you might remember, they went to the court to fight about the name. And this is how court justice system is relevant to whatever was going in the black metal in the 90s. I mean, people were doing their arsons, people were killing each other, people were like fist fighting on the streets and, getting drunk and all that stuff. And suddenly they're in a court of law fighting for names. Obviously, Gorgoroth was probably the first one to, happen that in the court of law, like name fights and all that stuff. Later on, the same thing would happen with Immortal. And now you're like thinking, so whatever was going on in your 20s with black metal being grim and rebellious and, anti-establishment and all that stuff, suddenly they're in the court of law fighting for name rights. It really gets silly. But then again, I also understand it's also about money. So this is the kind of a pivotal moment when bands started to become sort of a business, or at least job at the very least. That is, you go to touring and all that stuff, so suddenly a lot of money is involved, and like I said, at this point, Gorgoroth was signed to Nuclear Blast, the biggest metal label back in the days anyway. Well, at least in terms of extreme metal. So it was like a different world back then, and obviously things have changed. First of all, in my opinion, the songwriting with the later albums, starting with Ad Majorem Satanas Gloriam, Quantus Possunt et Satanam Trahunt, and with all that stuff, it isn't too shabby compared to the previous ones. They were all very listenable albums, to some degree quite enjoyable, but I would say these are nowhere near what was going on with the previous years here. Obviously, mileage may vary, opinions are different and all that stuff. For example, I wouldn't say Under the Sign of Hell 2011 is this bad, like here it says 42% on average. But I guess this is, I'm not going to read them, that's going to be under the scope of this video, but I'm guessing a lot of these scores are based on voting against the band. Whereas, it's very different in terms of quality. I mean, after all, the songs are still good, but, people sometimes go protesting. All I'm saying, if you really need to start with Gorgoroth, if you have missed the bands, go with the early discography first and then move on. If you started with the later ones and you never bothered to check out the first albums, man, you're missing out. So, from my perspective, I would say 3 first albums by Gorgoroth are the main attraction. They are the ones that shaped Gorgoroth to be whatever it is. And despite its vocalist differences and lineup changes and all that stuff, the band has been able to keep the package real. So what I'm saying, Gorgoroth is still a great live band, and even their later albums are not as good as the early ones. They are still very, very, very listenable. So all in all, I could say, yeah, Gorgoroth didn't turn sour like Emperor, or didn't turn sour as, Ulver, which changed their style tremendously later on. Are they as good as back in the days? No, but that happened to a lot of bands, so let's give them a little bit slack. So, Gorgoroth still kicking ass and all that stuff. Let's just hope that someday there will be a new album. I mean, this is the longest pause ever. If you really think about it and take a look at these numbers, 1994, 1996, 1997, 1999. Then it's time to move, finally, to Carpathian Forest, which roughly started 1992. Once again, their years active started before that with a different moniker, Enthroned. And that's a different story, of course. When we come to the demo phase, a lot of people I remember praising like Bloodlust and Perversion or Journey Through the Cold Moors of Swarthian or whatever, at least through Chasm Caves and Titan Woods was more or less the pivotal moment when people started talking about Carpathian Forest, like, yeah, have you heard it and all that stuff. Now, in my opinion, Bloodlust and Perversion, which was released as a compilation name as whatever, I don't think they're that good. I mean, it's a kind of a typical demo, which is like, yeah, definitely gonna shape out later on, but I don't think it's really that fantastic. Through Chasm Caves and Titan Woods, yeah, that's quite a big step up and all that stuff, but it was finally 1998 when the Black Shining Letter came out, and that was fierce. And also Strange Old Brew, with followed by, Morbid Fascination of Death. So these 3 first albums, much like Gorgoroth, in my opinion, define what the band is really all about. And one of the main things is, they also played this kind of a mid-tempo black metal, but they were always dirtier. They were always filled with this, what is here labeled as themes, dark humor and misanthropy, nihilism, BSDM. I mean, they have been going with, these weird topics which were not that prevalent. A lot of bands wanted to be super serious. Whether it was about anti-Christianity, whether it was death, misanthropy, and, dark topics in general, philosophical even. Well, Carpathian Forest more like flinging like double, middle fingers and like, we don't give a fuck. And starting as a two-man band defined by Frost and Norwegian, it was definitely something different. Now, a lot of people will say, well, a lot of great bands are, duos. If you really think about it, in a way, you could say it's Darkthrone. I mean, Darkthrone had more members, but it's mostly Nocturno, Kulto, and Fenris. Same thing with Satyricon, Frost, and Satyr, etc. We could even go as far as to say Emperor, in a way, is a dynamic duo with Samathanism, defining the whole thing. Or even Enslaved key members with Grudle and Ivar, so forth. So you get the point by now. But anyway, of course, there have been more members and maybe they don't get enough credit for being part of the band later on, who knows. But anyway, what separated Carpathian Forest with their own style was this dark humor and also the kind of a grin with their faces and audible bass. And I think that's one of the cool things that where bass is often overlooked, and it's almost like a whole black metal getting this and Justice for All syndrome, let's mix bass in the background. We just need to him on stage to look like he's playing actually something, but you don't really hear it. Carpathian Forest like, let's go with the 11. And that was something that kind of it helped it to define the whole shape and sound of Carpathian Forest. However, the band also had its turning point at some point, and Norwegian was like, okay, fuck off and die, I'm out of the band, and there were drugs and all that stuff. And also the style started to go, towards decline. I am definitely not saying that fuck you all, whatever, and even defending the Throne of Evil and all that stuff is as good as the early works. But people have different opinions, as you can probably see from Metal Archive's review score, whatever. And things started to change, and it's been like quite a many years since the previous album, 2006. Now this comes to a lot down to drug problems by Frost. So obviously the band was more or less on hiatus, even if you don't see it officially mentioned here on Metal Archives. Here you can get the feeling like it's been going on more than 30 years all the way, without no breaks and all that stuff. But obviously that's not the truth. Now, having done two Carpathian Forest interviews, one from 2017, one of the early ones for Rauta, and now at 2023 at Steelfest also, you can see the difference. You can hear the difference when you're listening to the opinion. Obviously, Carpathian Forest interview is not yet out by the time of this video, but it will be soon. So if you compare those two interviews, you can see the big difference between Frost, how energetic he is. And of course, this could really pave the way for some new material. We will see, I guess. Now, back to the very point. Which albums, which releases you should go with if you're new to Carpathian Forest, like which one you should check out first. I would definitely say, start with the first album. But even if you go with the later ones, the era is much like, the career is much like Gorgoroth. It doesn't matter if you go with the later albums because the style changes are not that big. And the quality drop is not that big. But I would say the first albums are the best. So pretty much like Gorgoroth, but with a little bit less change in quality is, in my opinion, what was going on with Carpathian Forest. It's not maybe as catchy, and it might be too perverted, too filled of dark humor and all that stuff for a lot of people who are looking for more sophisticated, more serious kind of stuff. But I think Carpathian Forest is a good band and good live also. So definitely something different, and that's something that already gets my respect. So when I was talking about those changes in 1998, well, that's when Black Shining Leather came out. That's when the band started to shape out. So that really doesn't apply here, really. So take it as you will. And then we go to the last band, but not the least one here, called Taake. Taake meaning mist, if I'm not or fog, sorry, if I'm not totally mistaken. And even though they started quite early, it's always been about Hest. Even if you take a look, there is a past members list having quite a bit of members, but not that much in essence if you really think about it. However, obviously, some of these people affected how the band would shape up over the years and all that stuff. But still, I would say it's always been mostly about Hest. If you take a look at the live members, list. That is vast. Because obviously there have been a lot of people, really can't do one-man shows. I mean, unless you're Hail Conjurer, but all that stuff. And like I said, Hust himself has been in various other projects, live member and whatnot, which makes him very, very connected, very active in the scene and all that stuff. The better, really. Now, since Taake started a little bit later and later, I guess that is also the reason why Not the Steed said Porten Vid came as a late as 1999. So this was already late to the party when people were talking about 1994, 1996, roughly that era, about the bands which were shaping up the Norwegian. I already did that list. So when Taake came on the verge of the millennium, you're like, okay, this is the new band. In hindsight, it feels kind of funny to say that because the band has been here for 30 years. But yeah, back in the days, it really seemed like it's the new band that is coming to the scene and, doing another set of Norwegian black metal. And now once again, we go to the 1998 year when the band started to decline. Well, Taake wasn't part of that decline process for obvious reasons. What Taake has always been doing is kind of interesting because at the same time I feel it's like this weird kid made by Carpathian Forest and Gorgoroth, like secret, out of marriage kind of a thing. They also had a little bit Carpathian Forest in the mix. They also had quite a bit of folky elements in the mix, somewhat melodic parts, but not going exactly the Winder direction. Another Norwegian black metal that went very folky and super melodic with its style. But Taake is always like you take a little bit of different ingredients and mix it, and that's what makes Taake Taake. The thing here is, it's not as grim as the bands like Carpathian Forest, Darkthrone, or the rawer ones like Ildiarn. But at the same time, when you think about the production and the songwriting and all that stuff, it's not as sophisticated as bands like Emperor or the spin-offs like Pekadum and whatever. So the thing here is, Taake has been always somewhere in the middle, but a little bit kind of a weird kid. Now, in my opinion, Taake is better as a live act than on albums. On albums, it's filled with interesting anecdotes. You will hear banjo one song, you will have mouth harp on another song, you will have some synthesizer part, keyboard parts in whatever song, or I don't know, whoever, violin or whatever. The thing here is, these were never dominant parts, like the banjo one. I remember when the promo came out and when I was reviewing it, I was like, banjo on a black metal album? Really? That sounds odd. But then like later on, it was like, this is a nice gimmick. It's a kind of a one-trick pony kind of a thing, so it doesn't really change anything. But it was kind of a brave move. You put a banjo part there and see how are the reactions. Or the mouth harp in one of the, I think it was actually this Dirt Squad album, if I remember correctly. It might have been Björkvin. And there's like one song where it's got like, probably Björkvin actually, when I was thinking about it. And that's it. You don't really like go overboard like adding it to the almost every song. It's like one song basically where it stands out and that's it. So it kind of it's interesting how to really go with a little bit like seasoning. I'm like, okay, it's like this herb. You just give a little bit of touch with it and then you don't go overboard it and people will remember it. It's like this fancy taste, but it doesn't really dominate the whole thing here. Now, all the way from 1999, when Not the Steed said War Pretty, all the albums are a little bit different from one another, but also always sounding like Taake. And this album came out in relatively steady pace. I mean, of course, there's like 3 years difference between Över Björkvin and Hordalands, and then only another 3 years between Taake and that one, another 3 years with Nordex Vapen and that one, another 3 years with Three the Twos. Let's get this here. So it's like every 3 years there's a Taake album, except after Kong Vinter. Now it seems like there's 6 years gap between the new album that is coming out September and this album before that. But there's one song out already, and this is it Uhyre av kniv. I don't know what that means. Kniv means knife. Anyway, this is a teaser of the coming album, and it might give you an idea that this is the best Taake thing come out ever. I'm really stoked about it. I've been honest about it. I've never been super stoked about Taake, album-wise. I mean, they're all very, very listenable, but at the same time, they're missing like the magical ingredient to make me like talk about it like, hey, Darkthrone or early Gorgoroth. Don't get me wrong, all are very listenable, all are some degree enjoyable. But when it's live, that's, in my opinion, when Taake is best. You will get to see Höst going like very active and very energetic on stage and just dominating there. With albums, it's more like almost like soothing experience versus live ones. But they are also, what is important in my opinion, they're all the same quality. It's consistent all the way from the first album 1999 to the rest of the albums. So whereas I would usually pick a certain era of any given band, like, okay, start with the 2 first albums and all that stuff, like I did with Gorgoroth and Carpathian Forest in this video, with Taake I would say it doesn't matter really where you go. I would actually say the later albums are a little bit better than the early ones. So I would probably say, wait for the new one. No, you don't have to wait anything, obviously. But you could just start with Stridens Hus or Kong Winter and go with those, rather than go with the early works. There's nothing wrong with the early works, but I think Taake has been progressing a little bit. And that doesn't mean like progressive metal, but songwriting is a tiny bit amount of better later on, which isn't something that I can say, for example, about Carpathian Forest and Gorgoroth. Obviously, this is just my opinion, so before you go and feel offended, triggered, unhappy, and all that stuff, don't shoot me. Your own taste is what matters to you, not mine or the guy to the next, the neighborhood or whatever. So if you like certain albums which are not my favorite, nobody gives a damn. Your own favorites are the ones that matter. But this video is then again meant for those who are not familiar with the bands at all. And they are now looking for like which albums I would start with. I would say with Taake, go with the inverted discography order. Start with the nearer ones. With Carpathian Forest and Gorgoroth, start with the early ones. Very simple as that. But all these 3 bands, they never gone steep decline. They always maintained quality or even improved it. That's the main point here, and these are all the bands that people should be checking out once they're done with bands like Mayhem and Darkthrone and Burzum and Immortal and Satyricon, and of course Dimmu Borgir, the biggest of them all. So if you're a black metal newcomer, I have some good news for you. There's plenty of good albums for you to check out. And now, the next episode, episode number 5, we will still go with some kind of a runner-up list, so relatively big or at least medium size of Norwegian black metal before we start going deeper and deeper into the real underground. So while we're still among the bigger bands, you will see some bands which are relatively quite known, and only later on we will go for the real underground. But stay tuned for more episodes of Norwegian black metal from the 90s Crash Course series, or True Norwegian Black Metal Crash Course, whatever you want to call it, it's okay. Now, I'm looking for your comments. Which of these albums are your favorites? Which of these bands are your favorite? And if there is a band that needs to be added to my list, let me know. But like I said, I probably already have it in my list because there's roughly some 70 names. But feel free to suggest me names and I will already reply whether or not that band is already applied to the list. And if it's not, I'm gonna add it there and talk about it later. Now, off you go, enjoy some good music, enjoy summer and all that stuff. And who knows, maybe I will see you in Bergen or beyond the gates. Bye bye.